Walking away from evangelical Christianity was the hardest thing I've ever had to do in my life because it was so intertwined with my personal identity. So once you have walked out of a high demand religion like evangelical Christianity, or, in some cases, slam the door and run for your fucking life, you're left standing like all on your own. You are disconnected from a community you may or may not have grown up in. Your moral compass points are totally scrambled. And you start to have all of these realizations kind of at once, like the Bible was written by men for men. Hell might not be real. Gay people aren't going to destroy your life. Like, it's a whole thing. And there's so much anger surrounding walking away from Christian mythology and feeling like you've been lied to your whole life. And this is very justifiable anger. I talk a lot about this because that's something that a lot of deconstructed people talk about, how it's all lies and it's all about control and power. And I do think there are certainly levels of intentional lying in the Christian church, especially from people in actual power who are preying on people who are vulnerable to get their money, or in some cases to sway them politically, right? And so there is that does exist, but one thing I think that's really difficult to come to terms with and have some more, I guess, room for forgiveness for is recognizing that for example, in my life, the teachers I grew up with, the pastors on a more person to person level, like, I don't actually think they were actively lying to me. I don't think the everyday Christian is actively lying about their beliefs because they believe what they're saying. So there's this whole element of feeling like you've been lied to your whole life and having, again, this justifiable anger without having someone to really point your finger at and say, this is the person that, in some cases there are. I think especially we have a lot of people in this community that who have dealt with, maybe coming out to their family and then they end up on the streets. Homelessness of LGBTQ community members, once they come out to their, for example, evangelical Christian family, they often have very serious material consequences. And that's not something I'm trying to brush by, but sometimes the walking away from the Christian faith is not as jarring, and so it's very confusing to look back and have, again, justifiable anger for purity culture, for a lot of the supposed Christian values, which we're going to talk about here in a second, that you look back and you're like, this is honestly immoral. This is honestly so fucked up. And it's hard. It's hard to leave the Christian faith. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about what comes next, like what happens after our Christian faith falls apart, because you still want to be a good person. And maybe in some ways of looking at that, it's like for the first time on your own terms, instead of being told what is or isn't good or moral or righteous. And so it's kind of hard to navigate having to figure out what good even means without a Bible verse at hand, or without a religious leader or a church elder spoon feeding you the answer. Does that make sense? So I talk a lot about how deconstructing from any high demand religion like evangelical Christianity is an intense process, specifically because our personal identity was so wrapped up in that environment. Everything from what you thought about aliens to like what kind of clothes you wore, at least in my case. And so when you start to critically think about like even one aspect of the religion you were raised in, it's kind of like tugging at one thread on an old sweater. And if you keep going, eventually the whole thing just unravels. And then it can feel very directionless and nihilist, and you can feel very lost. I certainly did. I struggled with the point of life. There are existential crises at this point that are totally valid. But I always try to encourage people to remember that the journey doesn't stop there. So before we kind of get into what comes next, let's start with some of the Christian values that I left behind on purpose, because there's a difference between, and there can be some overlap here, but there's a difference between leaving the Christian church because of specifically religious trauma, or like you were actively harmed by a congregation. Like that is one factor in walking away from the church. But sometimes the deconstruction starts because the actual ideology was unfounded and it stopped making sense logically, right? So I want to define just some of the Christian values that I started to see and took personal issue with. The number one Christian value that I think looking back was very frustrating, that I think is actually very relevant considering the time and place in which we're living now, is authoritarian obedience disguised as humility. There are so many scriptures I heard growing up about having a servant's mentality and being, as a woman, of course, there's all this submit to your husband. There's all of this submissive rhetoric that is used specifically for women. But I would say for everyone in the Christian church, the scriptures about the meek inheriting the earth, and the idea that questioning authority, that the idea that pastors speak directly for God, right? And that your own conscience, like your own internal voice, is suspicious at best. That's not a value to adhere to, in my personal opinion. That's a power structure, okay? And what I mean by that is, like, it was always framed that the voice in your head might be, it might be divinely inspired, but it also might be Satan. It might be the fucking devil, which is, yes, that's insane. But also, it's this idea that you cannot trust your own internal compass, and that you have to outsource it to your church pastor, to the Bible, instead of embracing the messiness of human-driven morality in the first place. And I think that really does play into how a high-demand religion like that turns or becomes so intertwined with authoritarianism, okay? Because I understand the concept of, like, having a servant's heart, as in just, like, being a good neighbor, being a good community member, and always being generous and having a generous spirit. Like, I do hold those two value, but my issue looking back is how often that concept was warped to keep people in line and make sure that humility was prized over empowerment. That is something that is very important to me. And I think that's how these institutions, how these organized religions protect themselves consolidate even more power and protect themselves from, like, scrutiny or criticism. Speaking of power dynamics, purity culture as morality, that was so gross looking back. I very much push back a lot against purity culture and this idea of, it's not just about saving your virginity for marriage, which let me talk about that. That is a huge issue, because for so many reasons. Not only does it, like, potentially lead to a very, like, legitimate incompatibility in the bedroom and how you navigate sexuality, like that's crazy to be I hate to say shackled, but to be, like, hitched to someone for an entire lifetime, and you guys don't even enjoy having sex with each other. Like, that's one danger. But another one is the imbalance of, like, how I think I saw one time that the average length of time that a woman has to have sex with a partner or partners before a partner can provide her with pleasure, like her body with pleasure, is like around a year, okay? Because that's how long it takes sometimes to understand the female anatomy, especially with the lack of literature compared to understanding men's anatomy, right? And men's pleasure. Like, the whole world is surrounded by men's pleasure. That's why we have war. Don't get me started on that. This idea of waiting until marriage is so harmful in so many ways. And it's frustrating looking back because it was framed in this sense that was a value. Virginity was treated like a value. It was treated like a personality trait at best, and the commodification of bodies, of people's bodies at worst. And that is super harmful looking back. Like, sexual repression is the root of all evil. It's not money. It's sexual repression. I can promise you that. More on that in a future live stream or video. And like, there's also the component of how men's impulses were always women's responsibility. So this idea of like women not being a temptation, or women needing to cover themselves so that men don't make these mistakes. And then women also had to be responsible for their own sexuality. Like, it's just all kinds of messed up. Purity culture was a big Christian value that I'm just not interested in. And I was talking about this with someone yesterday who hadn't grown up in this environment. And I was trying to explain like how everyone, like men's and women's sexuality, the burden was placed on women. So it's just frustrating, like, that I spent my whole life like that. Another Christian value that I think is very sinister is just the inherent nature of believers versus non-believers. This one is subtle, but it is so dangerous because it inherently leads to an us versus them morality. And almost like a moral, quote unquote, moral kind of supremacy that I am simply not interested in. Like, I'm not. Christian values taught me that I could love the sinner but not the sin. And I could love people while still believing they were broken or unclean or damned, or, I don't know, going to hell for eternity. Like, that's not love. If you actually have this voice in the back of your head, like, man, I really wish this person wasn't going to burn in hell for all of eternity because they're not good enough. Like, that's superiority. That's conditional. That is not love. Like, it's so dark. It's so dark. And it, again, like, it just goes, this is something that I honestly still struggle with because I even now, like, looking back at Christians, I'm like, how can you not understand how fucked up this is? Like, please go. And it's funny because you guys will hear me say all the time, like, critique Christianity, not the Christian, which is maybe a reverse version of love the sinner, not the sin. But it's not that I think that they're bad people or they're gonna end up in hell. I'm just like, I have pity that they're not that they're clinging to this mythology that is bringing them peace, and I do want them to have peace. It's just this whole weird thing. And one thing that helps me work through that is remembering my own personal uncertainty about whether or not free will is even a thing in the first place. So there's that. The Bible says women are basically property. Correct. Another big Christian value I was indoctrinated with that I left behind was Zionism. Oh yeah, we have talked about that before here on this channel, on these live streams, because in my flavor of Christian upbringing, we believed in the book of Revelation. We believed in the prophecy of Armageddon, according to some guy tripping on mushrooms in the desert a couple thousand years ago, right? Like, super detailed and violent and graphic words about what's going to happen in the end times. And I have like a whole podcast episodes about Christianity's obsession with Armageddon and the end of the world. But perhaps I would say the most sinister Christian value that was instilled into me as a child growing up in the evangelical Christian church is Zionism, is the support of the statehood of Israel, no matter the genocidal cost, no matter what violence was required in order to establish and then maintain that statehood. I mean, the word Zionist was used in my Bible class, in my middle school classes. I was told to be a Zionist. Okay, like it's not, that was not a fringe concept. That was very much front and center. Christian Zionism is a very serious issue, and now we are seeing the ramifications of the harm this is causing in the way that the United States government, via the Israeli government, is using Christian Zionism to justify the actions that Israel is taking as an apartheid state against the Palestinian people. And that's not to say, what I mean by that is, that's not to say that I think that the people in power making these decisions are actually believers in the book of Revelation, but they are using people who believe in the book of Revelation to get away with the violence that they are instilling, which I have talked about in depth. So yeah, those are the Christian values that I actively chose to leave behind. And I do want to talk a little bit about what I'm personally building instead, what we can build instead, because when we burn something down, we have to build something new. Otherwise, we're just free falling. It's chaos. And don't get me wrong, chaos can be a vibe. I can get lost in that personally, but we do need to have a little bit of structure to my freedom. So I've done some work on what my personal values are now. And what I think is interesting about this practice is, one, that it's mutable and that it can change over time, but also that it can be different for everyone. Instead of like a church leader or a pastor instilling values in us, I think it's really cool to do the practice of looking at a big ass list of personal core values, and then picking a few that resonate with you the most. I think that can be very, very powerful and very insightful. So here is a list of core values. And again, you can just Google core values and you'll find a list of core values that can maybe resonate with you. So these are some good ones. We have friendships, influence, learning, loyalty, optimism. This is a list of, I believe, 50 core values that can just be a starting point for us to come to terms with once we leave an indoctrination platform like evangelical Christianity. What actually matters to us moving forward? I think this is a super important practice so that you can have some kind of internal moral compass to just always remind yourself, like, actually, I don't want to, live my life in X, Y, and Z kind of way. What's more important to me is my personal core values, which are these instead. So my personal core values that I have established are adventure, peace, curiosity, community, and impact. Now, another interesting thing about this is that my list of core values can mean something different for me versus someone else. Like, for example, to me, adventure means I'm always trying something new. I'm very spontaneous and go with the flow. Like, I do not need rigidity of a structure in order for me to feel aligned. But for someone else, adventure could look like being an adrenaline junkie and like understanding, and doing all of these crazy actual adventures, if that makes sense. For me, peace means like an internal, my internal, intuition or gut instinct is checked off. It doesn't necessarily mean I always have quiet, right? But it could mean a very quiet, simple life for someone else. So that is what is super important to me. I very much encourage people to do a little bit of introspection about what your personal core values might look like,